This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law, and we are bringing you this week a set of fresh stories. So I will be handing over to Peter, who will introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thank you, Amelia. My name's Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and we've got some interesting stories, I think, that really highlight some quite interesting and thoughtful public policy points this week. So should be a good discussion. So I'll pass you over, Amelia, to kick us off.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story this week is looking at something we've kind of discussed in a lot of depth here. So this is the online safety bill. So this news story is looking at how the planned law would make sharing pornographic deepfakes without consent a crime in England and Wales. So another important point to mention here is that prosecutors would no longer need to prove that the person or people sharing these images intended to cause distress. And this is really important because in some cases under existing law, men have admitted sharing women's intimate images without consent, but have not been prosecuted under kind of the sticking point that they did not intend to cause any harm. And so this is kind of a big key issue and a big change here. And you can definitely see how they're trying to legislate in relation to kind of how things are changing and technology is moving on. So I will pass over to Peter to go through this in a little bit more detail.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, I think this is a fascinating change because there is that loophole that's meant that people have been able to get away with saying, "Oh, I didn't mean to cause, harm and distress." Well, you did. But arguing, "Oh, well, I didn't have the intention, I didn't mean it," it is almost nonsensical. So I think it's absolutely right to try and tighten that up. But it has to be done carefully because this can have also unintended consequences. Because there's a similar law in place when it comes to images depicting child abuse, whereby if someone sends that, they're guilty of an offence. But then if you really want to be a pedant about it, as some people have been, then, for example, the BBC a few years ago, as part of an investigation, they found a load of very harmful images on Facebook. So they took screenshots, put it all together, and then sent it to Facebook to report it. And Facebook said, you are sending these images, you're now in breach of the law, so we're reporting you for breaking the law. And you're like, hang on, we're informing you that this is your own platform that's hosting this, and instead you're going to try and clobber us for it. That's an adult, mature way of dealing with it, but okay. And I think the point here is that it's actually... And I've actually heard of this as well, where sometimes people have then tried to say, "Oh, we found this image online, and I don't think it's, I don't think it's like a deep fake." But what if you take a screenshot of that to show the individual, or anyone for that matter, and then you transmit that either via email or you send it via SMS or WhatsApp or whatever? Then you're technically going to be breaking the law. I mean, ultimately, I think the intention of changing the law on this is going to be to say, for the love of God, don't send it, is the point. And I think that's what we're going to have to get people to think about. But I think you've almost got to think about the well-meaning person who wants to report it or alert someone to what they've found, what they've seen, and they may then inadvertently end up breaking the law. But if that's the price that means that people then can't turn around and say, "Oh, well, I didn't mean to do it," can then actually face some sanction, maybe that has to be worth it. But I think perhaps it's more of a discussion needs to be had on it, perhaps. And I think that's sometimes the danger of the legislative process, that we end up ignoring some of these sorts of risks, and then something ends up being passed. And even though this online safety bill now seems to have been in various forms for an age, and I don't think anyone would argue that it needs to be brought in, but you don't want it to come in a ham-fisted way that actually doesn't actually solve the problems it is trying to address. And there's not a very good track record, unfortunately. There's a lot of government legislation that is very well-meaning on points like this, but then ends up causing more harm than good. And I think that's what they have to be really careful about. The point here is that this is incredibly badly needed, though. I mean, this deepfake technology is too widely available. You don't have to be skilled in how it operates now. Apparently, photographs could just be sent to certain accounts on Telegram or through to certain accounts, and they will just automatically then do a deep fake of the individual in that photo or on that video, doing various things as deepfakes, etc., are wont to do. But the point is that the people perpetrating this and doing it don't have to have any now technical skill or expertise. So it is freely available, very often very difficult to spot what's real and what's not real, and the consequences and lives that are ruined are also very, very real. So do need to have protections to think about this? Yes. Do we have to make sure that we don't knee jerk? Yes. Do we need to make sure that it isn't done in a way that actually harms more people than are necessary? This is all the sorts of conversations I think that we need to have and make sure that what ends up being passed is done carefully. For once, it would be nice actually if we actually looked abroad and actually looked at other countries where they've brought in successful legislation and perhaps follow what's done there. But very often, from when I've ended up speaking to politicians, they say stuff ends up being thought up in the Westminster Parliament as though we are on the far side of Mars and without any reference to what any of other country may or may not have done, bizarrely. But that's how it's always operated.
I think an important kind of point to mention here is when you're saying kind of anyone can potentially make these deep fake images. I found this one figure, and it's pretty staggering, the fact that one website which creates nude images from clothed ones received 38 million visits last year. And that's visits, so that doesn't even tell us, how many users. And that's not even using kind of any sort of explicit imagery kind of as a starting point. You are using a kind of clothed model there and then kind of manipulating that image. So it's very interesting from a technological point of view that, wow, we can now do this, but also there is that other side of the amount of risk that this comes with.
And the sheer volume there is quite terrifying. Not to mention, of course, that will just be one particular service that's out there, of which there are many. So this is becoming a problem. You've got an awful lot of people being potentially affected by this technology, and there does need to be protections in place, controls in place, because otherwise it's just going to proliferate, and the damage it causes and the lives that get ruined will be significant.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. So this is looking at fraud. So detectives have begun contacting 70,000 people suspected of being a victim of a sophisticated banking scam. So the Met Police is sending text messages to mobile phone users it believes spoke with fraudsters pretending to be their bank. So there have been more than 100 arrests in this investigation so far, and one man has been charged. So people that have been receiving these text messages kind of in the last 24 hours will be directed to the Action Fraud website. However, Peter, when I first showed you this story, you kind of came up with straight away with a really interesting point. The fact that, okay, you receive a text message from the Met Police saying that you've been a victim of fraud. Follow the link. For me, the first point and thing I think of is, crikey, this is another scam. So, I mean, realistically, these 70,000 people are going to receive a text message that appears like a scam. So, not quite sure what's going to be achieved here. I'll pass over to Peter to discuss in more detail.
You've highlighted the key point there, Amelia, exactly, that you get this text. Are you even going to think it's genuine? Should you follow the link? In fact, we spend an awful lot of time speaking to our clients and producing guidance that says, if in any doubt, do not follow a link that you receive via SMS or WhatsApp or Signal or Telegram or anything else for that matter. And the point here is that they've chosen how we're going to notify people. We'll do it in a way that will look like it's a scam. I mean, I'm the bane of my accountant's life, because whenever they send me links to check documents, I'm always like, is this genuine? Is this right? And they're like, yes, it's right. Here's the information. But I'm now that paranoid that I don't trust anything that I receive, even if it's coming from what looks like a perfectly genuine source. And the point here is that fraud increasingly is affecting an awful lot of people. This is 70,000 people on one highly sophisticated banking scam whereby basically people were contacted on behalf, in theory, of saying, oh, you bank with Barclays and your accounts at there's been some suspicious activity. Can we please run through a few things with you? And of course, then claiming to take people through security, the fraudsters would then take people's personal data as a result that was given to them and empty their accounts. And I think there is a collective feeling almost within government and law enforcement that things like fraud and economic crime of this type, it's a sort of a low level thing. It affects a lot of people, but isn't seen as, say, as important as, say, violent crime. And therefore it doesn't get the resources, doesn't get the attention. I mean, once again, they're directing people to action fraud, and we know that action fraud doesn't have the resources to actually do an awful lot about this anyway. And therefore, I think that we are getting to that sort of tipping point where, a bit like with antisocial behaviour 20 years ago, where the government had to introduce antisocial behaviour orders and do something to tackle what was seen as a rising amount of crime that was sort of antisocial behaviour, that was seen again as being sort of what the police would call low level, but actually ended up affecting an awful lot of people and leading to an awful lot of misery and making people feel unsafe and threatened in their communities and in their homes. And this is going to require a similar level of intervention ultimately by the government to ultimately stop people being so often, becoming the victims of fraud. I mean, there was one statistic I heard this morning which says that the average person in the UK has been the victim of fraud to the tune of £600 this year. You might say, oh, well, I've not been a victim of fraud. Well, that's the point, that there are those who haven't been a victim of fraud. There's therefore others that have been hit for many thousands of pounds to come up with that average figure. So in 1 year alone, we're saying that is a fairly significant figure. So I think it's getting to the point now that everyone has either been affected or knows someone who's been affected and is dealing with the consequences of quite serious online fraud. And arguably, it's going to take a little bit more than the Met dealing with this one scam and sending out some SMS text messages to do anything about it. And it's going to take a darn sight more than the very meager resources that action fraud have to actually deal with this. But I think it's becoming more of an issue to the public. And it's going to be a matter of actually showing some real leadership here. Now, in the past, in Britain, we've got the UK National Cybersecurity Centre. We've got other agencies that work together to protect critical national infrastructure. I think it will take a similar move from multiple agencies to come together to actually start being able to help people to be able to properly defend themselves from fraud. Now, there's an awful lot of people who are perhaps digital natives who can spot things that look fraudulent a little bit more easily than, say, those who might be 50, 55 or above, who can be bounced into actions that end up perpetuating fraud. And I think we're actually at a bit of a dangerous spot right now, because we have the whole issues around cost of living. If you receive a message that purports to come from HMRC saying, we think that you actually are in the wrong tax bracket and you've been underpaying tax, and therefore we're going to charge you a greater amount, please click here. That might make you panic into clicking on something. If you receive something that says, click here to qualify for UK government help with your energy bills, you might click on it. So I think fraudsters are going to be preying on people's fears and concerns around rising energy costs, cost of living, and the pressures that we're going to be going through this winter. So unfortunately, that's what these fraudsters like. They will prey on people's insecurities, and that average figure of £600 per person could end up being significantly higher in 2023 at this rate.
Thanks, Peter. And it's interesting that you mentioned that kind of those of us who are cyber aware can potentially more easily spot this. So if you have been a regular listener of this podcast, you may be aware that actually earlier this year, I myself fell victim to a scam. So essentially my phone service provider, they text me to say that my bill, there had been an issue with my bill. I needed to click the link to sort it. Coincidentally, I had just changed kind of phone supplier, and therefore this seemed pretty normal. It all looked the same, and it even came kind of, I have an iPhone, and it came through as kind of coming directly from my service provider. So little old me goes along, great, this will be sorted. And unfortunately, I fell victim to a scam. And it's like you were saying, Peter, everyone has now kind of heard of someone that has fallen victim to a scam or knows someone. And realistically, it seems like a low level crime. But for me, I had kind of almost £300 taken, and £300 taken is almost my entire rent. So in theory, if I hadn't have been able to pay my rent, luckily I hasten to add, that could have had a massive impact on my life, more so than kind of a standard, um, some other sort of low level crime, which truly is more of a low level crime.
And you actually highlighted there, Amelia, the fact that that £600 per person. I don't think anyone at the moment can do with suddenly being £600 a month worse off, because then that suddenly means that you either can't pay your rent or your mortgage or your heating bill or food costs or your train fares. There's so many things that people at the moment are not able to withstand that sort of shock to their finances, because people's credit cards are at a limit, their other sources of finance are simply not available, and then suddenly bang, if you've got a fraudster who's taken £600 or more away, that puts you in a really serious position. But at the moment, there isn't an awful lot of actual practical help out there from the government or from the banks, who very often go, oh, well, that's dear me, how sad. The only protection you've got is if that perhaps happens to happen on a credit card, and you're then potentially protected under the Consumer Credit Act. But it depends on how it happened and what security measures may have been compromised. And either way, there's not much of a safety net at the moment if you find yourself a victim of fraud. And arguably, this is where, as I say, it needs a more joined up approach from the both government agencies, law enforcement, and the financial services and banking sector, perhaps to try and redress the balance.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. So this story is looking at the European Parliament. So on Wednesday, the website was faced a very sophisticated cyber attack, disrupting its services moments after members voted to declare Russia a state sponsor of terrorism. So this is very interesting for multiple reasons, but just adding a bit more context here. The attack was what was known as a distributed denial of services attack, in which massive amounts of traffic were sent to the servers in an attempt to block the internet users from accessing the website. And then in turn, it's just so overwhelmed, you're just unable to actually do anything here. And so this is one of the favoured attacks from Killnet. So you may have heard us speak about this on the podcast before, and this is kind of a favourite instrument of the Russian hacker group. And realistically here, given kind of the geopolitical issues at play, it wouldn't be all too surprising to find that this did in fact come from Killnet, the state-sponsored hackers of Russia. So I will pass over to Peter to kind of give us more depth in this.
Yeah, thank you, Amelia. I think that's a fair conclusion to make, given the European Parliament had just passed a vote saying that, yes, Russia is a state sponsor of terrorism, given that they've been launching missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, knocking out their power grid, knocking out their water, and various other key bits of infrastructure, leaving people with no power or ways to stay warm and safe during the winter months in Ukraine. Sounds pretty terror-like to most people, and that's what the European Parliament thought. Yet clearly someone in Russia was watching, because bang, the whole system was then hit by a cyber attack minutes after that vote was made. So it's almost like just confirming exactly what the European Parliament was thinking if you then go and carry out an offensive cyber attack like that. I mean, one thing I was thinking, it's the first time in a while I've actually read about a distributed denial of service, DDoS attack. We always end up talking an awful lot about malware and ransomware, but DDoS is almost old-fashioned now. The idea of just aiming loads of activity at a platform, at a portal until it collapses, is almost older technology now, but still thriving when it comes to Russian hacking collectives, which may or may not be state-sponsored. And I think the other point here is that this is an example of the sort of the fallout from a major conflict like this, which has led to an increased number of cyber attacks across Europe. So you've had European institutions, national institutions in European and NATO states targeted in the UK, in Germany, in France, as well as supranational institutions like those belonging to the European Union, all falling under various types of cyber attack at different times. At the moment, the UK is very vulnerable to these sorts of things because it's in the middle of winter and our NHS is on the verge of not being able to cope due to well, various factors that I won't. It's not really our place to sort of go into that here. But the point is that there are a number of UK services that I think they are very cognizant at the moment. It would only take a well-timed cyber attack to push certain systems into complete breakdown. And that's similar as well to various places across Europe as well. But when you then hear of targeted attacks like this, it just shows how easy it is for nation-state actors like those in Russia to perpetuate very significant harm and damage as a result. And I was speaking at a conference at LegalX this week at the Excel Centre in London. I was talking about state-sponsored actors and how they are increasing the risk. And if we're thinking about, well, what will be the risks in the coming years when it comes to cyber threats? Well, the increased prevalence of cyber attacks from state-sponsored actors like these hacking collectives in Russia will only increase. And sort of inadvertently, you can find different organizations, particularly within, say, the financial services sector, so banking, finance, insurance, can also be hit by the sort of contagion of these sorts of cyber attacks, which can then bleed through more broadly through the economy. So unfortunately, we're going to be getting, I think, more examples of these sorts of attacks and the damage that they can sometimes bring. And that's going to be a feature of this decade, unfortunately.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our final story of the day. So, I mean, I pretty much say it every week at this point, but we're back again with Facebook and Meta. I mean, what a surprise. The gift that forever keeps on giving, even in the lead up to Christmas now. So, Facebook is being challenged in the High Court over the personal details it collects on users in a case that threatens the company's business model. So this specific lady, Tanya O'Carroll, she's 35 and a campaigner on technology and human rights, and she is kind of the forefront of suing Meta here. And this is because it will not let her opt out of the user profiling it uses to sell adverts. So O'Carroll was bombarded with baby content after becoming a mother in 2017. And when she kind of tried turning off the adverts, it did not work. Kind of after this, she found that Facebook had tagged her in over 700 characteristics based on her activity, which in some cases could have been deemed kind of special categories of personal data, such as homosexuality and the UK political party that she supported. And this is all kind of giving out big red flags here. So I'll pass over to Peter to kind of look at this in more detail and go over why kind of even more specifically looking at special categories of data than Facebook using these is such an issue.
Thanks, Amelia, for that run through. And I think the thing we need to highlight as well is that some of the sort of characteristics that the individual here was being profiled with were not correct. So the fact is that we've got sort of Meta's algorithms out there looking at your interactions online, not just on Facebook, I hasten to add. If you've got the Facebook app on your phone, that means that it is going through and looking at loads of data and information about other apps that you use, other things that you look at online. It's looking at your SMS messages, it's looking at your phone calls, it's looking at everything about you. It isn't doing that to the same extent if you've got an iPhone. Apple have now switched off that, or it gives you the option of saying, would you like to not be tracked by Facebook everywhere you go? And those people that click yes, then stop Facebook being able to get this sort of granular detail and put it together. But in this instance, we're seeing that Facebook sort of has all of these touch points. It takes those and then it starts to profile you as a data subject. It makes certain assumptions about you based on what you may have looked at, based on your interactions. And in this instance, Indeed, we're looking at assumptions made when it comes to those protected characteristics. So assumptions about sexuality, about political views, about ethnicity, all these things, it goes, oh, well, you like that and you did that, therefore you must be this, or therefore you must like that. Which, if you think about it, is dangerous, discriminatory, arguably, and just downright scary, to put it bluntly. Not to mention the fact that it's doing this across, in this instance, 700 different characteristics. So it's making some fairly significant judgments and taking some fairly significant judgments and positions about what it thinks it's each user is about, and sort of building a picture about that user that may actually not bear an awful lot of relation to reality. Um, and that's kind of the danger here. But furthermore, this data is being processed and handled, and profiles being put together and assumptions made and profiles put together. And then that's used for Facebook to think, oh, well, we think we'll put this in your feed and that in your feed. And then we'll also sell this information to advertisers. And then the advertisers can then decide what things to put in your feed and all this stuff. And you're like, yeah, certainly anyone who's got a working knowledge of basic data protection principles in Europe will be thinking, hang on, how does that fit in with the processing of data under Article 6 of GDPR, which talks about legitimate interest, it talks about the basis of contract, it talks about specific informed consent, it talks about those 6 bases upon which your personal data can be processed. What part of those 6 bases allows for Facebook to profile your specific protected characteristics? It's not really very clear, is it? And sometimes we make an assumption that large corporations like Facebook and others know what they're doing when it comes to sort of navigating the regulatory frameworks in different countries and in different regions when it comes to data protection and privacy and using data. Do not make the mistake of sometimes thinking that just because they may be very, very large and have huge resources and have loads of lawyers working away on this doesn't mean that they're doing it right or correctly. I mean, this is why Facebook has now been beaten by Max Schrems in court on more than one occasion. And he started off as an Austrian law student. He took Facebook to court and won. So it just shows they can have the resources and all of the lawyers in the sharp suits and everything, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the positions they take are right. It just means that they're then looking to potentially sort of bully and coerce people out of their way. And unfortunately, this whole story is sort of indicative of the sort of rather worrying practices that we keep hearing about Facebook, that I think more and more is actually proving to be a disincentive for people to join the platform, and in many instances is also leading to people saying, I think I've had enough, I'm going to leave now. So that's why, funnily enough, Facebook's global number of monthly active users is falling for the first time in history. I can't possibly think why. Finally, this story also talks about the fact that the lady who's been affected by this and is bringing the action is using a solicitor called Ravi Naik, who's a highly experienced solicitor dealing with data protection litigation of this type and defending the rights of data subjects. Anyone who's watched the documentary The Great Hack on Netflix, I am not for a minute saying that The Great Hack is necessarily entirely correct in the assertions it makes. Watch it and draw your own conclusions, but question things. Don't just sort of accept the whole lot. But it does talk about Ravi Naik and the action that he made on behalf of a data subject to object to the processing that Facebook was undertaking, and he won on that occasion. And as that same lawyer is now hopefully helping this individual with her claim as well. So he's an excellent litigator with a good track record, and we will be watching with great interest to see the progress of this litigation on behalf of this data subject.
Thanks, Peter. Going back to your point that you're making about kind of big organizations, it's funny that you mentioned that realistically you'd hope and you'd assume that they'd be able to comply with GDPR. So we had a client this week, a potential client, and they contacted us about a very well-known restaurant chain. And during this client call, we looked at the restaurant chain's privacy policy. And I think you used the word shocked and poor to describe it. I might be wrong, please correct me, but it was very appalling to read this privacy policy, which essentially kind of embodies GDPR and lets these subjects know, when they're using the website, what they're essentially signing away. And
Yeah.
to think this is a household name, and realistically speaking, I'd like to have thought that they would have a handle on this, but as we found out, this restaurant chain was not on top of GDPR.
Indeed, the privacy policy was pretty shocking, and it didn't even do a good job of telling someone who was reading it how to avail themselves of their data subject rights. So in this instance, if you were receiving marketing communications and wanted it to stop, if you wanted to exercise, the right to be forgotten, or you wanted to make a subject access request, a very long and tedious policy, when you actually went through it, didn't actually tell you as the reader, as a data subject, how you could avail yourselves of your statutory rights. That's kind of one of the first things we do when we're helping our clients with data protection policies, is actually say, let's say for each of these rights, how are we going to allow the visitors to your site to avail themselves of their rights should they wish? And we hope they will never have cause to, potentially, but if they do, we want to make it nice and easy and straightforward. Did that restaurant chain do that on this occasion? No. There were various other things, just fairly fundamental things that were missing from that policy, even down to, we've already talked about that Article 6 GDPR, the basis of processing. They just threw about half a dozen things from Article 6 at the wall, didn't sort of say what data was being processed under what. And we're just basically saying, oh, it'll be under this, this, and this. You're like, oh, that's nice. You've just thrown 4 out there, and I'm sure you'll then just claim that 1 or 2 apply. Well, guess what? Doesn't work like that. You have to say what data is being processed under what basis. It has to be very, very clear. That's the point. And if this is drafted by a law firm, or whoever drafted that policy clearly didn't understand the basics of actually helping their client, the restaurant chain, to comply with the absolute basics when it comes to data protection law. And that was just in Europe. This was a global chain. So, if their attention to compliance in Europe is that poor, what's it like when you go to New York? What's it like when you go to California? What's it like in Mexico or Canada? Probably equally as poor. But that's just it. They just put together a glossy form, throw a few terms on there, make it look professional, use a typeface, which is for some reason ubiquitous from US law firms. So surprise, surprise, I can see where that one came from. But with a fundamental lack of understanding about the concepts and issues at play. And furthermore, if you think that just cutting and pasting large amounts of legislation into your privacy policy does the trick, it really doesn't. It's supposed to be clear and written in plain English that anyone can read it. You shouldn't need to have a degree in jurisprudence or to understand technical jargon to understand the privacy policy. I won't rant any more about this, but you can probably tell that I have some fairly strong views. And what I really do not like is when I see policies like this that are not designed for lawyers or tech engineers. They're designed for the average user, and they should be navigable and understandable to the average user. And if they're not, it's not doing its job, and it's not demonstrating compliance to the regulator. So, in other words, what's it actually there for?
Precisely, and that's the thing when we are looking at these privacy policies. So I was doing a review for a different client, and I distinctly remember questioning a specific clause. And I only knew what the clause meant because I'd actually just done it at university. And this was a clause that I had to read multiple times to gather an understanding. And even then, I was a bit shaky on what it actually meant. And that's someone that is literally doing their legal qualification at university, fresh in the mind. And I was still like, crikey, 1, what does this mean? And 2, why on earth is it in here?
Exactly. And this is, as I say, an Austrian law student, Max Schrems, ran rings around Facebook a few years ago and continues to do so via his agency, which is called NYOB, None of Your Business, and continues to have a lot of success against major multinationals. And he's pretty much self-taught at this point. And it just shows, as I say, just because they're large corporations with lots of resources and lawyers, do not assume that they are demonstrating good practice and good compliance.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our final story of today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping us to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. In the meantime, if you wish to kind of listen or watch this podcast, we are available on YouTube and Spotify, Amazon, Apple Music, essentially anywhere you can find us, you'll find us if you look. And we hope to see you again next week. Thank you for listening.